I never imagined that shame could wear a fancy dress and taste like champagne. But there I was, third row back at my younger sister's wedding, squeezed into the only formal dress I owned. Everyone around me looked like they'd just stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, flawless, confident, as if they'd never had a bad day in their lives. My son Luca was next to me, his little feet swinging under the table. He wore a tiny navy blue suit that had cost me 2 paychecks and a week of guilt. But he was beaming like just being there meant something big. He truly believed that this day could somehow stitch us back into the fabric of the family. Maybe deep down I was holding on to that same hope. Vivian, my sister, glided through the day like she belonged on the red carpet. That had always been her magic trick. People were drawn to her like moths to a porch light, beautiful, effortless, magnetic, especially our mum. Vivian got the praise while I got used to being the comparison. She soaked in the applause and I figured out how to make peace with the quiet. But I came anyway. I showed up. I smiled when I was supposed to, applauded when the vows were said, and kept my voice calm when someone leaned in with a curious smile and said, "Wait, you're the older sister. You don't look like you've got an 8-year-old. Then came the speeches. The best man kicked things off, cracking a few soft jokes that got polite chuckles. And then it was Vivian's moment. I was bracing for something sweet, maybe a story from when we were kids, or a heartfelt toast about love and finding the one. I even raised my glass, ready to toast whatever came next. I should have known better. She held her crystal champagne flute like a queen and smiled that signature smile of hers as she looked around the room. "Thank you all for being here," she said, all glowing and gracious. "It means everything to share this day with you." Then her eyes found mine. "And of course I have to say something about my big sister." I leaned toward Luca and gave him a little smile. He looked up at me, his eyes full of excitement. For a second, I really believed she might say something warm, something generous. Vivian continued, "Al's been such a role model. She's a single mom, strong, independent, and clearly unwanted by anyone else." The room burst into laughter like she'd just delivered a punchline. My stomach twisted hard like I'd been punched from the inside. For a second I thought maybe I misheard her. Maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding. But then I saw her face, still smiling, like she'd just said something delightfully clever. Some guests glanced around unsure, but most just laughed louder, tapping their champagne glasses together like it was all some harmless inside joke. I didn't know where to look. My heartbeat was thudding in my ears. That's when Luca gently tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Why did she say that about you, Mama?" Before I could even figure out what to tell him, my mum chimed in from her table, clear as day and without missing a beat. "She's a used product, but hey, she still looks good for her age." This time the laughter was sharper, meaner, the kind that slices through your skin and leaves something bleeding underneath. It was a laughter that told me the room didn't see me as part of the celebration anymore. Not as a sister. Not even as a guest. They saw me as a joke, a spectacle, maybe even a burden. I couldn't move. My whole body locked up. My cheeks burned hot, but I wouldn't let the tears fall. Not in front of my son. Not in front of them. My fingers clenched the cloth napkin in my lap, holding it so tight I thought it might tear. I scanned the room, desperate for one person, just one to meet my eyes and show a little kindness. My grandfather was staring at his food. My cousin smirked as she scrolled on her phone. Even my uncle, who once said I reminded him of my late dad, didn't lift his head. Luca looked up at me with this puzzled little frown. His face was twisted with confusion, hurt, maybe even embarrassment. And that's what shattered me. Not the comments, not the laughter, not the humiliation. It was knowing my child was watching all of it, trying to make sense of why his mum, the woman who bandaged his scraped knees and stayed up late to help him with long division, was being laughed at by her own blood. I wanted to run. I wanted to scoop him up, push open the doors, and just keep walking without looking back. But I didn't. Something held me in that chair. Some mix of shame, pride, maybe even hope that someone would step in. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to shout that they didn't know me, not really. They didn't know the weight I carried every single day. But my throat was dry and my legs shook under the table. Then a sound broke through it, all the scrape of a chair being pushed back. I looked up and saw Callum Vivian's groom standing, tall, calm, deliberate. He didn't laugh. He didn't glance at Vivian. He didn't look around at the rest of the crowd. His eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, something about him, his expression, his stillness made the entire room go dead quiet. I didn't know what was coming next, but it wasn't pity. It wasn't drama. It was something bigger, something final, a reckoning. People love to say that being the oldest means you lead the way, that others follow your example. But in our family, I was more of a warning than a guide. My name's Lara. I'm 34. I'm a single mum. And I'm the one the rest of them whisper about when they think I'm not listening. I live with Luca in a small 2-bedroom apartment out on the edge of Tacoma. It's not fancy, but it's home. Luca's 8 with messy hair and a laugh that still makes my worst days better. He's the best thing that ever happened to me. The reason I find the strength to walk into rooms that still make me feel like I don't belong. I work 2 jobs, mornings at a local coffee shop on Pacific Avenue, nights at the front desk of a little roadside inn near the airport. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. On Saturdays, I make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. I can patch a hole in his jeans with a needle and thread. And every time he calls me his superhero, it's enough. That's what keeps me going. But in my family, none of that ever counted. Being a single mum wasn't strength, it was failure. And my mum, Judith, made sure I felt that failure, especially during the holidays. My mum, Judith, has always cared more about how things look than how they really are. She calls Vivian's wedding a fresh start for our family name, like it's some kind of PR campaign. Vivian's 5 years younger than me. She's the kind of woman people write articles about, gorgeous, accomplished, always walking into rooms like the spotlight was made for her. Everything seemed to land right in her lap, and somehow she always made it seem like she fought tooth and nail to earn it. She's Judith's pride and joy. If Vivian so much as sneezed, our mum would whip out a silk handkerchief with a proud little smile. But if I had the flu, I got a lecture about vitamins and how I needed to stop being so dramatic. Everything shifted when I got pregnant with Luca. I was 25, head over heels in love with a man who swore we were forever. By the 5th month, he was gone. Just disappeared, no message, no call, no clue. And my family. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't check in or offer a helping hand. What I got instead was a wall of silence, a few judging looks, and that classic "we told you so" air. But when I held Luca for the first time, all that bitterness they handed me melted into background noise. He was everything. Still, part of me hoped even years later that maybe they'd finally look at me, not as the mistake, not as the black sheep, but as someone who mattered, someone worth showing up for. So, when Vivian's wedding invitation came in the mail, I said yes, even though I wasn't in the bridal party, even though they spelled my name wrong on the RSVP card, even though I had to rent my dress and do my own hair in a fogged-up mirror while Luca practiced his smile in front of the TV in his too big tie. I convinced myself this might be closure, or maybe even an olive branch from the family, subtle and quiet, but real. The venue was stunning, white roses everywhere, fancy gold-trimmed plates, the hum of a string quartet floating through the air. Vivian looked like she belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine, all glitz and glow soaking in compliments like sun rays. When she passed by me, her smile flickered. "You made it," she said, like she was surprised I showed. Then she glanced at Luca and added, "He's getting big." No hug, no warmth, just a quick nod to small talk before slipping back into her spotlight. Judith didn't even acknowledge me. She breezed by like I was just part of the waitstaff. But Luca was having the time of his life. He thought the chandelier looked like a spaceship, and he whispered to me that Vivian looked like a real-life princess. When I saw his face lit up amazed, I decided to stay, even though that old ache was starting to settle deep in my chest again. That ache that always shows up when I'm around them too long. Our seats were at table 9, way in the back by the bathrooms. I laughed a little under my breath. How fitting. We ate our little salads. I wiped chocolate mousse off Luca's tie and pretended not to notice when whispers floated over glasses of wine, with my name tucked inside them. Then the speeches started, and I just knew this night wasn't about unity or mending fences. It was about Vivian being the star. And me, I was going to be the punchline. It all began like most wedding speeches do, sweet polished, like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror a few times. Vivian stood tall and flawless, holding her champagne flute like it was an award. Her dress sparkled under the reception lights, and just like that, the room fell into a hush, waiting for her next moment. "I just want to thank all of you for being here," Vivian began, her voice floating through the hush like she was center stage in a fairy tale. "Today is the happiest day of my life, and I'm surrounded by the people who mean everything to me." I sat at the back, quietly telling myself I must be included in that group. Maybe. Luca sat beside me, practically bouncing in his seat legs, swinging under the table, eyes shining like this was the most magical night he'd ever seen. Vivian kept going, talking sweetly about Callum, her new husband, about love timing fate. I let myself relax just a little. Maybe just this once she'd keep it graceful. Maybe this wasn't going to turn into one of her jabs disguised as a joke. But then she shifted gears. And of course she said with a sly glint in her eye, "I want to give a shout out to my big sister." I felt the spotlight turn, not literally, but in that way where you just know people are looking. I straightened up, smoothed my dress, smiled with the kind of polite warmth I'd spent a lifetime mastering. Then Vivian went on. She's always been such a strong example. Her voice was light, but there was an edge in it. The bravest woman I know. Raised a kid all by herself. No partner, no husband, just her. And well, whoever was kind enough to babysit. The laughter started soft, a few chuckles, but then it grew. My stomach clenched. Then she added, "Seriously though, it's amazing how she's managed. A single mom, unwanted by anyone but still showing up." This time the laughter was loud, unrestrained, and real. I felt like the breath got knocked out of me. My cheeks went hot, my hands frozen around the napkin in my lap. I looked over at Luca. His brows were furrowed eyes darting from one laughing face to another, clearly confused, trying to figure out why all these people were laughing at his mom. And then the worst hit. Judith, my own mother, laughed harder than anyone. She leaned toward her table mates and said loud enough for me to hear every word. She's a used product, but she still polishes up well. That wave of laughter was different. It wasn't nervous or half-hearted, it was cruel, confident, and it rolled through the room like a slap I never saw coming. For a moment everything blurred. I wasn't even sure if I was blinking or if my eyes just refused to see clearly. It was like being shoved into ice water. No one touched me, but every cell in my body felt bruised, and no one said a word. No one told her to stop. No one stood up. They just laughed, or stayed silent, or stared at their plates, at their wine glasses, at their phones. Even Grandpa Norman, my sweet, gentle grandpa, who once told me I was his little lion, the brave one, didn't look at me. He was there, but he wasn't with me. I was alone. And here's the thing, I could have taken it if it were just about me. I've had practice. I've learnt to swallow that brand of humiliation, to turn it into silence and walk away. But when I saw Luca's face, his worry, his confusion, the cracks in his joy that did something to me, that broke something wide open. I didn't stand because I had something powerful to say. I didn't stand to make a scene. I stood because I needed to move. I needed to breathe, to step out of that room before the shame turned into tears I couldn't hide. I pushed my chair back, my hands shaking, and then another chair scraped the floor. From the head table, Callum. He stood. His face had lost its colour jaw, clenched eyes locked on Vivian. But he didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone but me. And then, without asking, without hesitation, he took the microphone right out of her hand. The room froze. Just like that, the air shifted. The laughter died in an instant. No more whispers, no more clinking glasses, just this eerie silence, like everyone realised something had gone off script. Callum stood still, one hand on the table, the other gripping the mic. And I knew whatever was about to happen, it wasn't part of the plan. His eyes were fixed on mine, steady, unwavering. Not on Vivian, not on Judith, not on the crowd still settling into a hush after their laughter. Just me. For a split second I thought maybe he'd try to soften the moment, say something smooth to cover the damage. That's the usual pattern with my family. Smile, brush it off, sweep the wreckage under the rug and call it just a joke, or worse, just how we are. But Callum didn't do that. He didn't crack a smile. He didn't flinch. His expression was carved from something more complex than anger. It was deeper, like he was looking at something broken and wondering how it ever got that way. Before he could speak, I started to move. I tucked in my chair, reached for Luca's hand. I was ready to leave quietly, gracefully. No tears, no dramatics. I'd done it before. I knew how to disappear. But then Callum's voice broke the stillness, low and clear. "Ara, don't go." Everything stopped. Heads turned. The room tilted just slightly, like the gravity had shifted. Whispers rippled through the guests, fast and light, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I felt Vivian stiffen at the head table. Judith narrowed her eyes and the DJ hesitated, fingers hovering over the playlist. But Callum raised a hand and the room obeyed. He wasn't looking at anyone but me. "I can't pretend I'm okay with what just happened," he said, steady as stone. "I won't stand here and let that kind of cruelty pass as comedy." You could feel it the way the air thinned. He stepped out from behind the table, not rushing, just walking with a kind of controlled weight, like every step was pushing against something invisible. He didn't stop until he was near us, me, Luca. The mostly untouched salads, the table that might as well have been a spotlight. And then he faced the room. "I've heard a lot about family this past year," he said. "About appearances, about tradition, loyalty. But what I just witnessed wasn't family. That was mockery wrapped in ribbons and champagne flutes." People shifted in their chairs. Some glanced toward Judith, who sat like a queen watching her kingdom tremble. Others buried their eyes in their wine glasses. No one said a word. Then Callum turned to Vivian. "You mocked your sister for being a single mom. You turned raising a child alone into a punchline. And worse, you did it in front of her son." Vivian's mouth opened like she had something to say, but nothing came out. Callum didn't pause. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't ask for this spotlight. But she showed up. She sat in the back, she smiled, she brought her son to celebrate you. And you made that into a joke. I had never seen Vivian look anything but composed, until that moment. For once she didn't know how to arrange her face. Callum turned to the guests again. Ara didn't stand to defend herself. She didn't beg for pity. She's never needed a microphone. But I won't stay silent. Because if I'm about to marry into a family that thinks cruelty is just part of the entertainment, and shame is something we pass around the table with the dessert, then maybe I need to stop and think about the kind of man I want to be. Gasps echoed softly through the room. A woman at the next table whispered, "Is this really happening?" A fork hit the floor with a sharp clink. Luca turned to me, eyes, huge mouth slightly open. And me, I had walked into that reception just hoping to make it through the evening, just survive it like I had all the others. I never expected anyone to stand up for me, especially not like that, not in front of everyone. But Callum looked straight at my son and gave him this gentle, knowing nod. "Your mum's the strongest person in this room," he said softly. "Don't forget that." Then he turned back toward the crowd for the last time. "I think I've seen enough." With that, he set the microphone down, walked right past Vivian, without so much as a glance, and headed for the door. I stood there, frozen, still holding Luca's hand. The music didn't start. No one clapped. No one even moved. It felt like all the air had been vacuumed out of the room. The fairy tale had shattered, but for once I wasn't the one left picking up the pieces. As Callum disappeared through the exit, something shifted, something permanent. No applause, no forced laughter. Just the hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of a spoon hitting a glass. Eyes darted back and forth from me to Vivian, to the door Callum had just walked through. Vivian stood at the head table like someone had pulled the rug out from under her. Her spine, once stiff with pride, sagged. Her shoulders drooped. Her gaze flicked from one face to another, searching for sympathy and finding none. Shock, embarrassment, maybe even blame, but not sympathy. Judith was the first to break the silence. She jumped up her chair, screeching loudly across the floor. "What an ungrateful boy," she snapped. "He humiliated you, right in front of everyone, just like your sister. Selfish." But her voice didn't land the way it used to. The command she always had, the grip she held over any room, was gone. Her words thudded to the ground, empty. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. For the first time in my life, her voice didn't make me shrink. It didn't twist something inside me. It didn't win. I turned to Luca. He looked up at me, uncertain. "Are we leaving?" he whispered. "Yes, baby," I said, smoothing back his hair with a smile. "We're going home." I stood tall, took his hand, and began walking toward the door. People moved out of our way. Some kept their heads down. Others watched me, maybe wanting to say something but not knowing how. Maybe finally realizing something they hadn't seen before. We were halfway to the exit when I heard my name. "Ara." I turned. It was Grandpa Norman. His face was pale, his eyes glassy and red-rimmed. He stood slowly and, for the first time in years, stepped toward me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I should have said something. A long time ago." I nodded. I couldn't find the words to reply, not without my voice cracking. But I wasn't angry at him. I understood how silence can become a habit, how hard it is to break when you've been taught to sit still and let things go. I wasn't mad, but I also wasn't carrying their guilt anymore. Outside, the air was crisp, like the world had reset. Luca gave my hand a little squeeze. "Is the wedding over?" I looked down at him, then out into the night. "Yeah," I said with a quiet smile. "I think it ended exactly how it needed to." We drove home with the radio off, just the steady hum of the tyres and the soft rhythm of Luca tapping his fingers on the armrest. I tucked him in. That night, kissed his forehead and lingered in his doorway longer than usual. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. The next morning I woke up to a screen full of missed calls from unknown numbers, distant relatives, people I barely remembered. I ignored them all. Then came a text from a friend who'd been at the wedding. Someone posted Callum's speech on Facebook. Over 50,000 views. You need to read the comments. I opened the video. There it was, Callum calm and steady, speaking truth into a room that had been silent for too long. And there I was, too frozen in the background, holding Luca's hand. The comments poured in. "This man is a hero. She deserved better. I'm crying watching this. Every single mom just got a little bit of justice." I didn't cry. I didn't even smile, but I felt it, this strange stillness inside me. Something that had been knotted up for years had finally let go. Vivian tried to spin the story later, said Callum overreacted, said it was just a joke, that people were being too sensitive. But the truth had already landed, and no one was laughing anymore. A few days later, a small bouquet of wildflowers showed up at my door. No note, just a card with 3 words. To the Lioness. I didn't need to ask who sent them. The wedding never happened, but something far more important did. For once, I wasn't the one left holding the shame. I wasn't the one expected to apologize or laugh along to keep the peace. I walked out of that reception hall with my son, with my dignity intact, and with my head held high. And somewhere in that chaotic, uncomfortable moment, someone stood up and reminded not just a room full of people, but maybe the entire internet what real strength looks like. It's been 6 months since the wedding that wasn't. Vivian and Callum quietly called off the engagement. No public statement, no cryptic Instagram post, no dramatic goodbye. Just silence. The kind that says everything. Vivian slipped back into her usual social circles like nothing had happened. The photos from that night vanished from her feed like they'd never been there at all. She hasn't reached out. And honestly, I didn't really expect her to. Judith called once, not to say she was sorry, not to acknowledge what had happened. She just wanted to let me know I had embarrassed the family for not playing along, for not laughing at myself like a good little sport. I listened for about 30 seconds. Then I said something I never thought I'd be brave enough to say. I'm not your scapegoat anymore. And I hung up. No drama, no anger. Just clean, clear, done. That moment taught me something. I didn't need a grand gesture from them. I didn't need a family meeting or some weepy reunion where they finally saw my worth. I didn't need them to change. I just needed to stop waiting for their permission to see myself clearly. I'd been holding out for something I already had the power to give myself. My life didn't turn into a fairy tale. I still work long shifts. I still pull double duty as a mom and breadwinner. I still make 2 dinners, some nights pancakes for Luca broccoli for me. But something in me is different now. I don't walk through the world hunched over by years of guilt and shame. I don't hide in the corners anymore. And Luca, he's changed too. He asks more questions now, the smart kind. He wants to understand why people can be mean and why others choose to be brave. He talks about Callum like he's a real-life superhero. Sometimes I catch him using his action figures to act out tiny speeches, standing up for the underdog, telling off the bully. And when I see that I know something shifted in him that night, I know it will echo through who he grows up to be, a kind, strong boy who isn't afraid to speak when it matters. One evening, as we were brushing our teeth, Luca looked at me in the mirror and asked, "Mom, are you still sad about what Aunt Vivian said?" I paused, then shook my head. "Not anymore." "Why?" He shrugged, a streak of toothpaste on his chin. "Because I think you won, even if it wasn't a fight." That stayed with me, because he was right. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw any insults back. I didn't demand an apology or try to embarrass anyone. I simply stood up, held my son's hand, and walked away. And someone else, someone no one expected, decided that my silence wasn't good enough anymore. Callum didn't just defend me. He reminded that room, and maybe anyone who saw that video, what love actually looks like. Not the kind that's posed for pictures or wrapped up in wedding vows. The kind that recognizes hurt and says, "Not on my watch." If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being alone doesn't mean you're unwanted. Being kind doesn't mean you're weak. And once you reclaim your dignity, no one can strip it from you again. So, no, I didn't dance at my sister's wedding. I didn't toast the bride. I didn't catch a bouquet or cry under twinkling lights. But I left with something better than their approval. I left with clarity. I left with my little boy beside me, and I left with the quiet, steady truth that I don't owe anyone an explanation for who I am. That wasn't the ending anyone expected, but it was exactly the one I deserved. If this story reached something inside you, if you've ever felt small, silenced, or dismissed in a room full of people who should have had your back, hear this. Your voice matters. Your dignity matters. And you are not alone. If this meant something to you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. ChatGPT Danoi, I'd really love to know, have you ever had one of those moments where someone finally stood up for you, or maybe it was the moment you had to be the one to stand up for yourself even when it felt impossible? Those turning points stick with us, don't they? They change how we see the world and how we see ourselves. If you want more real stories like this, ones that hit you in the chest, flip expectations, and remind us what being human is all about, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for being here. You matter, always.